The materials that you're going to need to make a pine needle basket are, of course, pine needles. I have some on branches still that are soaking in here, but I also have a lot that I had pulled off individually and placed in the water. This was lukewarm water. It's now cold. Since these are green, I don't think it's pertinent that the water stays hot. I think it's more about just keeping it wet and hydrated. I have artificial sinew here, an embroidery needle, a tea towel, a very used tea towel, just to try and make sure that, as we lay pine needles out and pull them for the basket, that we can see them. Sometimes they have a little bit of sap and they're sticky, so it's nice to have something protecting the table that you're working on. And scissors. So this is all that you need to make a pine needle basket. I wanted to review prepping your needles. I know that we talked about soaking them, but I just want to explain a little bit about my process and a method to my madness, which is I take all of the needles that have, or needle clusters that have 5 needles in them. Anything less than that, I'm going to return to the woods. The reason I'm doing that is because then it helps with keeping the diameter consistent when I'm pulling them and adding them to my basket. The other thing is that some needles, you can see here, there's a dried section. If it's particularly brown, if it's a long piece rather than just a small little section that's dried out, I am harvesting these in the winter time, so I'm running across that a little bit more than I probably would in the spring or summer. If that's the case, I'm discarding that and putting that back in the woods just because it's a little brittle, even when it's soaking. I just really don't want a lot of little pieces to be splintering off and poking out of my basket. And that's also why any pieces that are already snapped, so if I have needles in the cluster that are much shorter than the rest, I'm also taking this and returning it to the woods. So these I'm going to toss, and these I'm going to keep. Okay, so to start my basket, what I'm doing is taking clusters of the needles, and I'm going to count out to get the diameter that I want. So this is 14 clusters that I've added together. As I continue to weave through the basket, obviously these needles aren't long enough to weave an entire basket, so you're going to be weaving more clusters in. So the way that I talk about this is there's needles, there's clusters, okay, and then there's bunches, which is this whole thing. It's all the clusters and needles together. I am going to be adding in half of the volume every time I'm adding bunches into the basket. And the reason being is that, they don't all end at the same time. So I'm going to be overlapping, and I don't want to have a ton of bulk right here. I'm going to be doing 7 clusters, so I'm going to have a little bit of overlap and then 7 more clusters and a little bit of overlap, so it'll come out to be the same diameter as these 14 as we continue to add. So I'm getting all of the joints of these clusters together at the end of this bunch, and I am going to be wrapping them with sinew to start off. Now the sinew that I have here, I already have it threaded, and then I also have it relatively short. Reason being is that the longer that your sinew is, the harder it is to manage. Things just get tangled up. So try to keep it all relatively short, and the lesser of the two evils is just having to tie knots into this and pull the knots through the basket rather than getting it so confusing and knotted throughout the sinew itself that it ends up being more of a challenge to actually weave the basket. So again, I'm just getting these all together, and then I'm taking the end of my sinew and I'm actually going to put it kind of inside of these clusters. I'm putting the tail into here, and then I'm pulling that sinew and wrapping it around the end. And the reason why I put the tail in there kind of perpendicular is because that way it just hides it nicely. Things are less likely to come unraveled. Okay, so I have the end here. See that? And then what I'm going to do is actually turn the needles over. Continue wrapping. Sometimes they will break off, and that's frustrating. Ideally, the less that you handle it, the less breakage you have. But for this video, I'm kind of trying to keep my hands out of the way, and I'm losing grips, and then I keep touching it. Okay, so there's my second turn. Okay, now I'm going to turn it again. And sometimes you'll have the needles start to feather off right here, right at the second turn. So they'll be springing up if they were shorter. If that's the case, what you're going to start doing is taking your needle and threading it through and wrapping that edge or that turn. But since we have enough length, I'm actually going to keep it here. And I'm going to wrap it once. Wrap it once, wrap it twice, and then this is where I'm actually going to take the needle and start to actually, because I don't want so much bulk, I'm continually wrapping over. Ideally what you want to start doing is threading through. Oh, and look at that. So it ended up not intentionally going on this corner. I could also just turn it up here because my intention was to keep it up here. So I think that's actually what I'm going to do to start off. And go again. Okay, now that's holding it pretty good. So that's how we start off. Okay, so to sew or weave more needles into my basket base, what I'm going to do is take that next bunch that's half of the original and lay it, overlay it. Uh-oh, dog's barking. And I'm going to be sewing it in right on top. Okay, so you see that? See how it's added in? And I don't keep a very short amount here because I found that as I pull, sometimes they slip through as well. So usually when I'm adding, what I'll do is I'll add the cluster, I'll leave enough of these joints and the end so that I'm not going to be pulling them accidentally out, and I sew them in twice. I'm really sorry about that background noise, guys. Oh, yikes. Neighbor dogs, my dogs, they're all talking to one another. Okay, and then I'm just going to continue up. Eventually what's going to happen is I'm going to be sewing this way, and then as well as this way, and then as it grows, diagonally and diagonally. So I'm going to have about 6 spokes of sinew that are going to be coming out of this basket. So I'm going to continue to work on that. And then this one's going to be a relatively narrow base so that I can show you how to start going up the sides of it. Okay, so two things that I wanted to point out to you guys. The first is you can see how, oh, there we go. You can see how I'm adding pretty close to where I had previously added. And that's just because some of these needles are actually really short compared to others. So there's the occasional time where I'm actually having to add it pretty close together. The second thing is, as I'm binding in these new layers into the base, when I'm sewing the sinew through, I'm not sewing it deep into the previous turns and coils. What I'm actually doing is sewing it just on top into the previous sinew, and that way I'm avoiding shoving this needle through all of these bundles and breaking up the needles. I'm also at the end of the line for my sinew here, so I'm going to be adding a new piece, and all I'm doing is sewing like a very basic knot. So you can do whatever you want here, in all honesty. I am not by any means somebody who, like, I do not have the Boy Scout or Girl Scout skills for knot tying. But I try and get it as close to where it's coming off as possible. You can see I kept it really short, and the reason being is that, to me, I don't mind if a knot is showing. What I do mind is if I have a knot tearing through all of these needles. So if I keep that knot relatively close to where it was coming off of, I don't have to then pull it through. I'm so sorry if it's not focusing. I don't have to then pull it through all of the sinew and kind of in this layer right here. I can just keep it where it is. And so what I'm actually going to do is cut ends of this, and I'm ready to go. I can continue wrapping and weaving. Okay, so I've created my base, and what I'm going to do now is start trying to build up the sides. So I'm still going to add 7 clusters in a bunch onto my basket. But this time what I'm going to do is I'm actually, can you guys see that? The zoom on here, or the focus is not automatic, so it's a little frustrating. I'm going to be sewing it in there we go. Just trying to make sure I have all these little like ends of okay. And rather than pulling it out to the side, what I'm doing is pulling it on top. So I'm actually creating a wall, if you guys can see that. And I'm just going to continue to do this. I'm going to loop through the bottom. Oh gosh, sorry. I'm going to loop back up through here. And I'm going to be honest with you, my stitching, there is no rhyme or reason. I think that as you continue to practice this stuff, you get your own groove, you find your own pattern or technique. I have not found mine yet. I did find mine when it comes to building up the side of the walls, and I'll show that to you guys when when I get a little bit further here and start building it up. And to me, I don't mind that the base looks kind of, just scattered, that there's no real pattern down there, because I want it to be a solid base. I don't want their things to be breaking off. And also, you know, you typically don't see that as much as you will the outside edges. So what I'm more going to be focused on is making sure that the outside edge is a little more aesthetically pleasing. And again, I'm just taking it, putting it through the sinew. Every once in a while you'll catch some of the needle in there, the pine needle in there, and ideally you want to avoid that, because I've noticed that when I do that it breaks the pine needle. And when you put all that effort in to try and get them the same length, to avoid getting ones that are already broken, to then go and break the needle while you're trying to sew it in, it's a little disheartening. Okay, so you see what I'm doing here? How I'm pulling this up? Again, I'm sorry if the focus on here isn't ideal. Gosh, I just looped my tea mug. Okay, so I'm going to be adding another bunch of 7 clusters soon, and I'm just going to continue to progress. But yeah, all you're doing is pulling it up on top rather than having it out on the side. Another thing that I'll mention is you can continue to pull it in. Each row that goes up, you can pull it in, you can stretch it out, so you can have baskets that like make waves or do whatever. I'm just going to be pulling it in and then building on top, so it's just a vertical wall on the side of the basket. So I'm going to continue with this, and then I'll show you the final steps of what I do. I will add one more thing about the pattern that I do on the side as far as weaving in the new clusters or bunches, is I actually like having all of these little joints sticking out. I think that is a fun little design. It makes it a little more rustic, or it shows, you know, some roughness to it, versus having it be these clean rows and rows and rows with just the needle showing, or the needle edge showing. So what I like to do when I'm putting new bunches is I take all the joints, put them together, and then, you know, typically like what we did down here is if you wanted them sewn in and kind of hidden, you would put it on top and sew. But what I'm actually going to do is put it on the outside and then lift the rest of the needles on top. So I'll show you that real quick. Tell you what, it is so much harder to do this while looking through the screen of my phone. Okay, so you see how I have it on the outside here? There we go. And then what I'm just going to do is, when I sew through again, what I'm doing is going through the top of this sinew. You can see that? And then okay, so I've kind of started to twist it up on top of the previous ones. Now, something that I really appreciate is that this is all pretty flexible. So you see I just pulled the needles in and out, so you could try and make them a little more even, and it will get tighter and more secure as you continue to weave. And the sinew is really waxy, and since these are soaking, they're really pliable. So you have a lot of wiggle room to kind of, you know, make some modifications. To say I wanted to stretch these out or try and get, you know, all the sinew lined up as much as I can. You know, you can shift things around without doing a lot of damage. I wanted to show you guys the interlocking stitch that I'm doing on the side. So how I just kind of make sure that everything's cinched in nicely, and also what winds up happening is like a little spiral pattern. I'll show you an example of it, but it kind of winds at a diagonal as you build up the sides. But all I'm doing is wrapping my bundle, and then through the sinew here, I'm sewing through the top, crossing over. And so that kind of interlocks the previous stitch, and you can see how they're built up on one another. There's a little bit of a gap in between each bunch or bundle. I don't mind that there's a gap. This is so tiny. This could be like a ring holder, so I'm not holding anything that I anticipate would be small enough to slide through those little cracks. But by doing that, it just creates a little bit of uniformity on the sides. And I think that that looks aesthetically pleasing. And then you have these little knobs at the end that pop out that look fun. So the end result would look like this. You see how it goes diagonally across. And then when I'm done, once I get to the top, what I intend to do is kind of pull it in a little bit. And once I get to the end of my thread, you see how that's pulled in? So all I'm doing is doing one last round where I'm tucking it in. And then once I get to the end, let's say this was the end, I'm just kind of weaving it back through a few times, or maybe keeping it long enough that I can actually tie a loop and put it through one of these stitches and tie a knot. So for example, that's what I did here. You can see I just tied a little knot back through this stitch right here, and it cinched it off, held it together, and that's the end result. One little mini basket and one slightly larger basket. It almost looks like a nest, which I think is nice. I think that it's important, you know, with what I'm learning with baskets is, yes, you know, there's a craftsmanship and definitely a skill in having it look uniform. But I'm going to allow myself the space to have it look a little messy, because I think that shows the handcrafted aspect of it. And then keeping these little knobs out here, that really shows off the material that you're working with. Like this, you can see that it's out of pine needles, which I really appreciate. So to show that the plants that I'm working with, I think is really important. Okay, so that's my basket.